I'm going to tell you the story of my mother. I'm a fiction writer, and both my parents were fiction writers, but as you all know, truth is a lot stranger, and if you tried to write in a book, nobody would believe it. All this happened back in 1984. This is my mother. At the time that this all happened in 1984, my marriage was breaking up because I'd fallen in love with Mel Calman, the cartoonist, and this was his first birthday card to my mother. He didn't know what he was letting himself in for as far as plots went. And have the next one. I just put that in because I like it. My mother was a writer, an illustrator of children's books. She wrote about 40 children's books and illustrated them. And at the time that this happened, 1984, she'd just written her first thriller that was called The Bassington Murder, her first grown-up, and indeed, as it turned out, only grown-up book. My father was also a writer, called Richard Hough, and he wrote about 120 books, many of them fiction as well. So, writing and making up stories was deep within the family. But 4 years before this happened, my parents had had a very, very traumatic and catastrophic divorce, and they'd split up, and things hadn't gone well at all, which might be partly to do with the reason that my mother found it very difficult to write the next book, because her confidence was gone. What she did was to put her energies into other things, one of which was visiting old people and joining the Samaritans. Annette Harding, or Anita Harding, was an old lady that my mother visited in sheltered housing in Primrose Hill. She was an orphan. She was orphaned at 6. She had had such a lonely life that when she went to boarding school, she stayed there over the holidays because she had nobody to look after her. She'd never married. She'd had very, very few friends. She was 83, I think, when my mother was visiting her, nearly blind, riddled with arthritis, and very, very unhappy. She called herself a non-person, and my mother really was her only friend. My mother belonged to the Progressive League, which did have some connections with they used to talk a lot about assisted suicide and things, although my mother wasn't interested in that particularly. But when Anita, she was called Anita because actually her real name was Annette, and she'd never dared correct anybody when they got it wrong. That's how sad she was. My mother was visiting her one night, and Anita said to her that she had decided to kill herself, and she had joined Exit, and she'd got all the rigmarole in place, which consisted of a typewritten thing to go round your neck with a plastic cover saying "do not resuscitate," the right amount of pills, a bucket, and, as it turned out, also a plastic bag and a ribbon. She asked my mother if my mother could please come early in the evening so that she could sit with her and hold her hand, and my mother said yes, because that's the sort of person she was. Then Anita, or Annette, said, "If the pills don't work, will you promise me you will put the plastic bag over my head until I die?" And what on earth could she say? Do you have the next picture? I've forgotten what it is. Oh yes. This is where my mother was living at the time, in Camden Town. It comes into the story in that, in fact, it turned out to be the house of a very famous murder in Victorian times. A woman called Mary Piercy went to this house where her boyfriend's mistress lived and her child, went and slit their throats. So my mother already had a certain form in the murder thing. That was her house. And I lived opposite her. Anyway, that night, which was the night before Guy Fawkes' night, my mother went down to visit her, sat with her while Anita took the pills. Anita went into a coma, but didn't die, was still breathing. After 4 hours, my mother put the bag over her head, tied a ribbon, and waited until the breathing stopped. She then sat there reading her book for the next hour or so until dawn came, and then she took the plastic bag and let herself out, because the warden of the sheltered housing would then be coming in to look at the occupants. When she came home, she told me, I was living opposite her in Camden Town at the time, she told me what she'd done, and she told various sisters of mine. She also told some other people, because my mother was extremely indiscreet. And we all said to her, crikey, you know, what an amazing and courageous thing to do, but for God's sake, shut up about it. But she didn't. And somebody snitched on her. And the first I heard of it was I was bicycling down Parkway into Camden Town when I saw an Evening Standard placard saying "thriller writer arrested for murder." And I thought, oh, that's neat. And then I thought, fuck. It's my mother. Let's have the next picture and see what it is. Oh yes, my mother. She was arrested. She was charged with murder. She was tried at the Old Bailey. She had a very good barrister. She presumed that she would get off. George Carman. The plea was not guilty to murder. Halfway through the trial, she was told to change the plea because the whole trial, which several of the more recent ones are about, is whether the pills would have done the job without the plastic bag, or actually the pills weren't enough and the plastic bag was a coup de grace, in which case she'd be guilty of murder and it would be mandatory life. So she changed the plea to guilty to attempted murder, something she didn't really want to do. What happens when somebody's convicted at the Old Bailey or any court is they literally disappear like Orpheus into the underworld. They disappear through a hole in the ground. You hear clanging keys, doors slamming. She disappeared from our lives as if she died. We went back to her house and there were these half-finished Mary Celeste tasks around the house because she did think she was going to come back. And it was very extraordinary because it was as if she died. In those days, in 1984, you were allowed 2 letters out a week, I think, and you were allowed to visit once every fortnight. So me and my sisters went to visit this traumatized woman. She was considered old. She was my age. She was 60. The judge said, by the way, what he said, I rather like the sentence, when he was convicted, he says, "It seems to us that Mrs. Hough was too ready to play an active part in the procedure and use of the paraphernalia of death." She was sort of rather made an example of, really. Prison to her was complete and utter hell. She was mercilessly teased because she was rather posh, because she was old, because she was trying to write a novel of all things. She wrote 28 quite amazing letters, very funny, often from prison. She was talking about inmates searching for dog ends and rolling them up in Tampaxes, of inmates squatting down and defecating and picking through their turds to find packets of drugs which they'd got through kissing people at visiting hours. She did find one lavatory with a lock that belonged to the governor, so she used to go in there and go to the lavatory, hoping the governor would never find her. She talked about, she'd be locked up in a stuffy room from very early on in the evening with eight people, the windows locked, bed by 9, obliged to listen to the strident criminal talk. She said, very sleepless at night and wake to hear the breathing, the fattest one rather noisy, and feel so comforted at such cosy human warmth round me, and then I suddenly remember who they are. She was considered a toff. They made fun of her accent. They put her into Coventry. At one night they threw a bucket of cold water over her. It wasn't quite Amelia. She talked about in her this particular room of 8. The lowliest in my room, an elderly Scottish rag picker, says the worst of prison is having to mix with the class of person you would normally have nothing to do with. Oh, can we have another picture? That's one of her children's books. Can we have the next one? That's another Mel one. And can we have the next one, which is probably a newspaper? Yeah. That is Anita. And if you can do the next, that's the result of the thingy. She says, apparently all newcomers are roughed up for 2 months, but I'm generally acknowledged the worst ever. She went to a Christmas sermon at the local church where the sermon was making the most of your precious time. She said, at visiting hours, we would go, as I said, every fortnight. She wasn't about alcohol. She liked a gin and tonic, my mother. So we would bring her liqueur chocolates, really good ones with thin chocolate, and she'd clip them open and drink each one, Amontillado sherry or something. You couldn't bring any Polaroid pictures because they were that you could put drugs into the little pouchy bit at the bottom. We bought a smoked salmon sandwich, just probably put everybody off with that toffee thing, and felt very, very weird. It was a posh place. She went to East Sutton Park in Kent, which is rather a grand house, and because she was rather grand, she'd come and see us out, and she'd come to the door, and only then would a meaty lesbian hand grip her shoulder, and an officer would say, "Charlotte, this way." She said, the difficult thing, the only thing that kept her sane was writing her novel and crawling around, desperate for a place to write. The manuscript was stolen, the typewriter was stolen, the typewriter ribbon ran out, and she said, I'm just now writing with colourless indentations on the page. Like, I was doing Anne Frank's diary a year ago, and I'm not trying to equate them, but when you're incarcerated, the only way you can stay sane is to live in your imagination, and her struggle to retain her sanity and keep hold of this manuscript, which was totally always being stolen, was just ghastly. She said, please excuse the writing, I'm always on the crouching in a dark corner to escape loud and endless drivel. Never in the history of novel writing can a novel have been written under such circumstances. I've been skulking around, trying to find anywhere to settle. Every time I found a chair or a corner, there was a little crowd of people saying the most poisonous and terrible things that somebody else about somebody else. And then I was put into Coventry. The general wind-up here is terrible. You can literally feel your heart thudding. I can't think why we don't all have strokes. Such a lot of them, the inmates, are about 6 foot 6 inches tall before they start being fat. And totally mad, of course. Heaps of them are that, and I can see it happening to them. She also describes going on an outing to Maidstone, where we ages to get ready to go out, herded from one little pen to another in a dazed condition like very shabby sheep, signing endless forms, 3 grown-ups to 7 of us poor, inadequate, conceited, shifty children. When she got out to this on this day off, I couldn't think of a word to say throughout except to sweet stallholders in the market. In Boots, my inmate companion spent ages puffing and puffing on the free scent and loudly flirting with the male assistants, telling them jokes with a punchline because its best friends are nuts and it lives next to an arsehole. Not one of my mothers, really. And she drew back. She wrote, for instance, what a panorama of faces has passed me by. Millions of Sharons and Karens and Lynns and Lorraines, arriving shocked and tearful, progressing to bossy horridness or distressing dottiness, and finally departing triumphantly in their enormous cars. Writing a novel was the only way she could get outside time. What people were doing was killing time, and that was the only way she could stay outside it. She won the Arthur Koestler Prize for it. The Arthur Koestler Prize is awarded to anybody in prison who writes something creative or does something creative, which are usually cathedrals made of matchsticks, but in her case it was her novel. When she was released, she got gate fever, which everybody gets. She said, I can't imagine what I'm going to be like socially. Madly excitable, totally silent, deeply suspicious, wildly aggressive. My nerves are at breaking point. I can't bear ever to be told ever again how to behave, what to think, or what to feel. I never want to hear any more about sex, whether feverish, starved, or arch. I can even understand about being frightened of the traffic. In other words, I'm unfit for human consumption. And I thought one danced out, all wreathed in smiles and took on the world. Nobody knows the first thing about prison life. You're literally put away, and that's it. The end of this story is out of this death came a life because, can I have the next one? You've forgotten my pictures. No, the one after that now, we've done that. Thank you. That's my little sister Bryony, and that's my father burying her in sand. Because my mother was hardly allowed, and she could only write 2 letters a week, she had a lot of support for what she did, hundreds of letters. So we became her post office, me and my sisters, and we'd divide the letters up between us. My little sister Bryony got the letters, she started replying to the letters of a young schoolmaster who'd been very supportive of my mother. And when my mother came out of prison, my little sister met this young man, immediately fell in love with him, married within 1 nanosecond, and here they are getting married. There, that's Bryony. She already had a little boy with an unknown father when she married this man, but the marriage produced, next one please, Sam, that one, can have one more. And so this little boy, because my mother put a plastic bag over an old lady's head, this little boy is now in the world. He is about 20 now. Isn't that an extraordinary ending? So out of all that misery and death came this gorgeous young life. I think there's one more. I think there's one more Mel. soon to be a major movie. But I don't think it can, 'cause I don't think anyone would believe it, because if we had longer, I'd tell you more, and it's jolly, jolly interesting, but I'm sure I've gone past my time. Haven't I? Oh, I'll talk about a whole lot of other stuff. Anyway, thank you very much.